Today's debate is entitled Thinking With and Beyond Marx. For me, the justification for this starts right here at Brown, where in the past few years there has been a distinct uptick in interest among my undergraduate and graduate students, of which a couple are hiding in the crowd, to thinking with and beyond Marx. For us in Africana, it has come from a time in the world when the dire events, both locally and internationally, demand that we listen more closely to people like C.L.R. James, Angela Davis, Walter Rodney, Sylvia Wynter, Stuart Hall, and Cedric Robinson, among many others. For this debate, we thought it might be appropriate to start with the prompt, quote, "The crises facing the world, political, environmental, economic, unprecedented though they are in scope and scale, were nevertheless fully anticipated by Marx's work. As Fredric Jameson observed, it is not we, but reality itself that is Marxist in its structure. And 21st century reality is as Marxist as any preceding period. If we must move beyond Marx in order to grasp our political predicament, we can only do so by continuing to think with him," unquote. And we hope in the next 90 minutes or so, with the help of our highly qualified guests, to generate a rich and informative conversation. So let me introduce them and then speak very quickly to our procedure. Jodi Dean is Professor of Politics at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. She's the author or editor of some 15 books. I say some because there may be more since I write. Some 15 books, among them Zizek's Politics, 2006, Crowds and Party, 2016, Comrade, an Essay in Belonging, 2019, and most recently, Capital's Grave, Neo-Feudalism and the New Class Struggle. Jodi has battled against the currents to both remember and reinstitute a more activist Marxist praxis in the academy and far beyond. We warmly welcome her to Brown. Alex Gourevitch is Associate Professor of Political Science here at Brown and is the author of From Slavery to the Cooperative Commonwealth, Labor and Republican Liberty in the 19th Century, and among many others, The Right to Strike, A Radical View, published in the American Political Science Review in 2018. He's a regular contributor to Jacobin, Dissent, Salon, and the Boston Review. I have to add that when I first saw his article, The Right to be Hostile, in the Boston Review last July, a brilliant attempt at thinking through the Gaza encampments and demonstrations and urgently asserting the right to speak and protest, I immediately wrote a note of congratulations to him and wish to repeat my sentiment, this time in person and in a more public space. Alex, welcome even though you're here. But before I begin, I feel compelled to offer you a short preface. We are in a time of war. Bombs are falling on Tehran. Bodies, among them those of children, are being ripped apart, ground into dust, and buried under rubble by bombs and planes, paid for with our tax dollars. It is a time of barbarism, of invasion, and of death. And as my fellow Caribbean poet, the late Martin Carter, wrote in relation to an earlier British military occupation of his country, Guyana, and I read from Martin, "This I have learnt, today a speck, tomorrow a hero. Hero or monster, you are consumed. Like a jig shakes the loom, like the web is spun, the pattern, all are involved, all are consumed." Let us approach today's debate with the sense that we are all involved, all consumed in this unimaginably tragic moment, and that any attempt to hold conversations around Marx and Marxism must inevitably be linked to a close reflection on our times and how to understand the power of capital, its relentless circuits, and the predatory mayhem it inevitably generates. in order, hopefully, to find the avenues and means to change this horrible world in which we live and to make it a better place. So now, on to how we shall proceed. Each speaker has 12 minutes to lay out their case, followed by 5 to 6 minute responses. I may intervene from time to time for clarification or to make a limited comment or not, until we are roughly halfway through the debate. In fact, 90 minutes into the debate. At that point, we'll stop for refreshments, everyone. And when we resume, we will have another round of comments and then take questions we'll have questions from the floor and another round of comments. So shall we begin with Jodi?
Great, yes, thank you. Should we clap for Brian? I think so. Is the mic on? Is that right? Yeah. So I've kept saying I want to be in conversation, not really debate, and no matter what, it gets more and more formal. 12 minutes rebuttal, all this. So I hope it'll be conversation. And I'm really delighted to be thinking together with all of you, with Marx, with Brian, with Alex. The prompt that Brian just alerted y'all to addresses Marx's relevance for us. Right? That's the way I read it. It's about, is Marx relevant for us? Given that capital has enclosed the world, that capitalism is global, my view is that we need to think with Marx. Marx provides us with crucial tools for understanding where we are. So I take the challenge of the prompt, or what my task is here, is to set this out, right? To spell out what's involved here. So clearly there's some disagreement today over Marx's relevance, right? Even though people on the right are all worried about cultural Marxism and the communists taking over New York City. Still, the 20th century was not characterized by world proletarian revolution. More prominent were national liberation struggles and the subsequent envelopment of the post-colonies in neo-colonial arrangements of US-led imperialism. By the end of the 20th century, the Soviet Union was defeated, and the formerly socialist bloc had succumbed to capitalism and nationalism. Socialist parties accepted market reforms because there is no alternative, in Thatcher's immortal words. Just as a previous generation of European socialists abandoned the dictatorship of the proletariat, so did the next one abandon the working class altogether, as union membership steadily declined, and the politics of class was displaced by a liberal politics fragmented into multiple competing identities. The result is that the right is resurgent, and the left lags further and further behind. The last 50 years have been a period of counter-revolution and defeat. Neoliberal globalization, US imperialism, has subjected the entire world to the dictates of capital. The networked, personalized digital media of communicative capitalism have transformed our basic interactions into fodder for the private wealth accumulation of tech billionaires as they destroy entire economic sectors. AI is accelerating this destruction and enclosing us in neo-feudal relations where tech lords take a cut from our every interaction, and they're finding ever more means to keep taking more and more. Now, some think that these defeats mean that we need to move beyond Marx, that we, the left, need something completely different. I disagree. Marx remains indispensable. The question that matters is how. Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, tells us that Lenin consulted with Marx. Lenin read Marx as a guide to action, turning to him, Krupskaya says, not to arm himself with belief in the power of the working class, belief in its ultimate victory. Lenin had sufficient of this faith. Lenin consulted with Marx for help in finding answers to the burning questions of the workers' movement, for a guide in thinking through the challenges of revolutionary struggle. From Marx, Lenin learned how to apply dialectical materialist methods to the study of historical development. Lenin consulted Marx as a matter of practical urgency. He turned to Marx not to understand Marx, but to use Marx to understand his time. Now, our time is not Lenin's time, although we are still in an imperialist epoch of finance capital, monopoly capital, and the exploitation of weaker nations by stronger nations. Today, many of us lack Lenin's faith in the power of the working class. So our task is twice as hard. We need to consult Marx for confidence and inspiration as well as for methodological guidance. Maybe our task is even 3 times harder since we've been in a situation of working class defeat. In State and Revolution, Lenin observes how great revolutionaries like Marx are turned into harmless saints after their deaths. Their canonization dupes oppressed people by giving them defanged revolutionaries who no longer pose a threat. Excoriating opportunists in the labor movement for pacifying Marxism, Lenin writes, they omit, obliterate, and distort the revolutionary side of its teaching, its revolutionary soul, and push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie, end quote. Half a century later, the Guyanese revolutionary Walter Rodney raised a similar critique of those who, quote, denude Marxism of its revolutionary content, end quote. Rodney points to those armchair Marxists who treat Marxism eclectically as, quote, merely another variant of philosophy, without looking at the class base and without looking at whether an ideology is supportive of the status quo or not, end quote. We see this eclecticism today. Criticism of capitalism takes the place of its overthrow. Analysis of the value form gets detached from class struggle. Fetishism is fetishized and capital's circuit of reproduction reproduced. We see Marxists themselves unable to imagine capital's end. In our time of monsters, of war, occupation, genocide, intensifying inequality, authoritarian ethno-nationalism, climate change and ecological ruination, billionaire tech lords, and the rendering of ever more people into wasted surplus populations. In such a time, we cannot afford to let Marx become yet another citation in the works of philosophers, historians, and literary theorists. No jab to philosophers, historians, and literary theorists. Marx is indispensable, and when I say Marx, I mean Marx, Lenin, Krupskaya, Rodney, and the entire revolutionary tradition. The revolutionary Marx is never Marx alone. Marx as a solitary author, but Marx as a contributor to a global line of the struggles of the oppressed who consult him to develop, deepen, and extend the knowledge necessary for the fight against capitalism and imperialism. How then should we consult Marx in our counter-revolutionary times? Just as Lenin did, as a weapon of theory and a guide for action. Marx's analysis of capitalism remains crucial because, as Rodney says, all the world has been incorporated within the capitalist system of production. Marxism is the body of thought, grounded and tested in mass struggle, that aims to overthrow this system of exploitation and oppression and replace it with an emancipatory egalitarian system coordinated by the associated carers and producers. Anyone who is convinced that there is no alternative to capitalism, or that capitalism will endlessly adapt to and overcome all its crises, of course has no use for Marxism. That's why reformists move on. They might hope for support from a working class that they view as destined to permanent submission, but Marx is of no use to them. Marx is a theorist for revolution, not a Foucauldian happy positivist, content with demonstrating the multiple interlocking ways we reproduce our own oppression. Marx is for those convinced of capitalism's historicity, that it began and that it will end, and that another world is possible. We consult Marx for guidance in understanding capitalism, the specificity of this mode of accumulation, its laws of motion, its strengths, and its weaknesses. We consult with Marx because we know this system of exploitation, oppression, immiseration, and spoilage will end. We want it to end. We seek to understand it, to help to bring about its end. and to create a better system to follow it. I associate what Rodney refers to as eclectic treatments of Marxism with the abandonment of the temporal outside to capitalism. Theory becomes eclectic when it lacks a horizon that lets it get its bearing. It satisfies itself with ethics and aesthetics, with ideas for individuals to ponder, consume, and enjoy as they choose. It's whimsical, Rodney says. You can have any road because, after all, when you're not going anyplace, you can choose any road. Rodney links this eclecticism and whimsy with failed attempts to break with bourgeois thought. He's actually criticizing Kwame Nkrumah here. Pan-Africanists tried to find a course between bourgeois and socialist alternatives, but couldn't. Because of their setting in imperialism, they inevitably sided with the bourgeoisie. For us, it's different. The eclecticism characterizing so much political theory in our time is the result of political retreat, the concession to the neoliberal claim that there is no alternative. Some are led to say, well, we didn't win, so we should throw out Marxist analysis and accept reality. Marx never said overthrowing capitalism would be easy. Capitalism and its domination of the world developed over centuries. We should not assume its demise will be rapid, a single event happening everywhere all at once, especially under imperialism's dramatically uneven conditions. We consult Marx and the tradition he helped inspire to continue this struggle even when it's hard.
Thank you. Alex, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Brian and Adi, for the invitation, and Jodi for the excellent opening statements. I can't tell yet how much you and I disagree, but I am here, I think, to sound a note of pretty severe skepticism, at least about the Jameson quotation, maybe about what you said. So I'm going to say what I'm going to say here as an opening, as if Jodi pretty much didn't say anything that she just said, because it's fairly prepared, but we'll see. So Jameson's quotation is that we are not Marxists, reality is Marxist. And I think at this point I can't think of anything I disagree with more than that statement, because it seems to me that reality is not at all Marxist in the way that it matters. So we all know the case for why it's the correct thing to say. I mean, compared with when Marx wrote Capital, not just the industrial world, but the whole globe is way more capitalist than it was. Primarily agrarian Western societies only really became majority wage-dependent workers in the 20th century. The global population wasn't really integrated into capitalism until the 20th century, and it's only in 2007 that the global population became majority urban and wage or income dependent, and so really fully subsumed, you could say, under capitalism. And not only that, but wage dependence, or the basic sociological condition of being in the working class, spread to demographic categories that hadn't experienced it. So, for instance, in the United States, women, only more than 50% of women were part of the formal labor market in about 1978. So, in many obvious ways, the world's become more as Marx really predicted it rather than described it. But the reason I don't think any of that is all that helpful or useful is that in the way that really matters for Marx and for Marxism, the world today is extremely different from the world that Marx described, which is, I think, Marx is nothing without proletarian revolution. Marxism has no ground. It has no way of organizing and unifying all of its empirical hypotheses and its normative commitments in the absence of a mass militant working class movement with a revolutionary tendency. That was the kind of social fact that Marx could just take for granted and use as the basis for developing his theory, and Marxism orient itself in light of the prospect of organizing that working class to overthrow capitalism. But the world we live in, and this is why I can't quite tell, I think you and I read the result of the 20th century similarly, but I think the implications differently. But the 20th century ended with not just the disintegration of Marxist regimes and the defeat of Marxist parties, but with the sending off of the working class itself. So even if descriptively it's true that the global population is wage dependent and in that sense part of the working class itself is experienced what I think was a really world historic defeat. And you can show it graphically. Look at patterns of strike activity from about 1970 to the present in countries as diverse as India, Japan, Germany, France, the United States, and Mexico. And they all show the same line, 85 to 95% declines in strike activity, just as an example. And I think if we can't take that into effect, and that's the most important fact, the most important feature for Marxism, it seems to me. And in that sense, our reality is absolutely not Marxist at all in the way I can make sense of what Jameson might mean by that. And I think that has to be incorporated into any effort to make Marx relevant, is to recognize that Marxism isn't, at least Marxism as a political ideology, isn't. And that, in fact, the way I've sort of always read that Jameson quotation is that if it's true that reality is in its structure Marxist, then it means the kind of basic concepts that were developed also, at base, apply to our present reality. But I think that's a recipe for just dogmatic and mechanical thinking that leaves us really unable to grasp the present at all. And it actually ends up being a pretty dangerous disposition. So let me give two examples about the kinds of errors I think get involved in thinking that the present's still basically Marxist in the way the past was. So one is it will lead to just ordinary dogmatic mechanical thinking, which leaves people in a position of, I don't know, irrelevance or delusion. So consider the party form. The party form emerges as sorry, I realized when I wrote this sounds like it's not actually to get you, Jodi. I know you. I really like the things you've written about being a member of a party and all that. So I want to preface that by making very clear that this is a long-standing thought I've had for making this kind of argument. It's not directed at you, and I know your participation. So this looks more pointed than it's intended to be. But consider the party form. The idea of a political party with a vanguard structure emerges as a way of solving the question of how to mediate between a revolutionary leadership and the working class base in conditions where there is a militant mass working class movement that might be mobilized in order to seize state power for the purposes of revolution. It makes sense in that form as a structure for Marxist politics. And it's a way of figuring out how to, as Marx says, the workers must first constitute themselves the nation, by which he meant in the Communist Manifesto. They must first seize state power in order to overthrow capitalism and then become international. However, and so again, that makes sense in an era where you can take for granted the historical subjectivity of the working class. But when the working class gets sent off, when it is no longer a social force that could be organized through the party form, because it isn't there as a political force, as the working class, now political parties have become the opposite. The party form has become a way for Marxist parties to recruit passionate, moral, clever lefties who have learned their politics in college and become part of those parties and become a device for separating them from the working class. In fact, parties now serve the opposite function of separating this potential kind of leadership from the very groups that it's supposed to represent because of the background conditions in which the party form is supposed to operate. And I think this is something we can't see unless we recognize just how fundamental the historic defeat of the working class was at the end of the 20th century. So that's one example of where you end up with Jamesonian style thinking and just mechanical application of categories. But it could be worse. So it was very kind of Brian to mention my right to be hostile piece. But consider another example of where we can fail to incorporate the very changed conditions in which we're thinking about the relevance of Marx, which is the familiar conventional Marxist critique of bourgeois right, or formal democracy, or civil liberties. So when Marx writes on the Jewish question, which is usually where people pull the Marxist critique of bourgeois right from, he takes for granted that what we're talking about, or the direction of political development, is the classical liberal state, which organizes its authority around the protection of unconditional absolute rights for each of the citizens, who then enjoy a zone of freedom to choose how they're going to live without having to give an account of themselves to anyone else. Yeah. Now, that is not the kind of state that we live in. The kind of the political forms and the ways of thinking about civil liberties and rights do not imagine a robust, self-willing, free-choosing agent that affirms its rights against others and demands protection for unconditional rights. Instead, what has evolved over the past decades is a different way of thinking about both the subject of rights and the rights they have, which is that the basic subject is someone who's vulnerable to the harm that others might cause them when they exercise their freedom. And this has created a way of thinking about rights that are, in fact, relative and conditional, rather than absolute and unconditional. And the role of public authority is to protect people. In fact, public authority has been organized around protecting people from the dangers that free individuals pose to each other through the exercise of their accountable right. And what has emerged is the idea that actually civil liberties are first conditional on people's willingness or ability to prove that they pose no harm to others. So this instead is a distinct way of thinking about rights. And this is a way of thinking about rights that has emerged both in private institutions like universities and become one of the major ways in which public authority is organized. Now, if we fail to recognize this as a pretty significant historic change, think about, I mentioned my article because this is what kind of gave me the insight into how free speech is thought about. We have seen the proliferation and extension of theories about free speech and about the ways in which, on the one hand, there are more and more forms of speech that are understood to be harmful or dangerous to people, and on the other hand, the idea that people have a right to be safe from feelings of being threatened or feelings of being harmed by the things that other people say, regardless of whether those people pose any actual threat to their rights as such. And this has become a way in which the exercise of power has become legitimated, and it was exactly the way of thinking about how to crack down and institutionalize the crackdown on free speech over recent years. But that was just the administration seizing on a way of thinking about liberty and individual rights that had developed as much on the left as on the right for decades. Now, if you just show up with the familiar Marxist critique of bourgeois right, you end up being a handmaiden of the very authorities that are cracking down on rights because they don't think about rights that way anymore. It's not the same kind of liberal state that Marx had in mind. But we miss that, and then we just become what the right says we are, which is cultural Marxism, an ideology for authoritarian repression of freedom, rather than a doctrine trying to find the places for the expansion of universal freedom. So these are examples to me of the way in which not only is reality not Marxist, but if we fail to adjust our thinking and our political orientation in light of just how much the world, the political and social world, has changed in light of that defeat, then we end up misapplying categories and even defending positions and forms of authority that we think we want to criticize. I think that's enough, actually, to start a conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's more than enough, and the games, in fact, have begun. So I'm just going to let you proceed, and you may respond as you will. I have a caveat, but I'll leave it to the break or something.
I had prepared a different set of round of responses, but because I didn't know what Alex was going to say,
Yeah.
so instead I'm just going to respond to Alex. First, I think, as I actually emphasized, that when we talk about Marx, we've got to recognize we're always talking about more than Marx, right? I mean, even it was always the Communist Manifesto is Marx and Engels, for crying out loud. So it's never just Marx. And then we recognize that we're thinking within a much longer tradition. And so just presuming something like, oh, there's a rising proletariat that is 100 million strong all over the world, and here comes some Marxists who are going to say, hey, I've got a political idea for you guys. That's not what it is. I don't think it was ever that way. I don't think, so what I hear, Alex, I hear a kind of description of a prior, very strong, pretty organized working class that then Marxism is a response to. What seems to me to be more accurate is that that may reflect part of a European story. I don't think it reflects the story in Russia, and it clearly doesn't reflect the story in China or India, most of Latin America, where it wasn't simply a movement of an organized proletariat, but it was always a movement also of agrarian workers and a movement for national self-determination and a struggle against colonialism. So it seems like once we recognize that Marxism in practice was always more than a particular kind of social democratic extension of unionism in a European context, that then our imagination opens up and our ability to see political possibility opens up. So that's my first point, is that Marxism is always plural. It's not just Marx, it's global. The second thing I want to say is that, I do think we agree on the kind of time of defeat, but we shouldn't overstate it as if there's not sort of, large communist parties at work elsewhere in the world, right? Large workers' movement, even in the defeated United States, right? We've seen over the last years really strong strikes from nurses, strong strikes of teachers. We've seen more organizing of Amazon warehouse workers, Starbucks baristas, graduate students, untenured faculty, right? This is clearly small compared to industrial workers' revolution. Organizing. I'm not trying to say it's the same. But I do think that we should not discount what's going on. I also think that it's really crucial, and I think feminist writing, 50, 60 years, have really emphasized that working class struggle is not just struggle at the point of production, right? Consumer struggles, consumer boycotts, housing and tenant organization struggles. These are also forms of class struggle. Right? I think we should also look at the database struggles as forms of class struggles because, right, I'm talking about the anti-AI database struggles that, not database, data center things. Yes, thank you. Data center struggles. These are, I'm involved in some of these in upstate, we say upstate, central and western New York, where it's really communities against super bad billionaire, multi-millionaire tech people coming in and saying, oh, we're going to override your local government. We've got the land. We own it, blah, blah, blah. You can't do anything. It's really actually a class struggle. Does it mean everyone's united? No, that's part of what class struggle is and has been. So I want to say, so that my first point was we have to broaden what counts as Marxism. And we have to broaden it two ways. We have to broaden it globally, and we have to broaden it in terms of how we think about class struggle. Once we do that, then I think we're in a better situation to say, sure, part of our reality is Marxist.
Oh, okay. I was just enjoying the flow. So yeah, we do disagree quite a bit then. I don't think Marxism is just equivalent to resistance. So the fact that there are people engaged in resistance in various places to the injustices they suffer is what it is. I'm not against it, I'm not for it, I'm not saying anything more about it. But I'm suspicious of the attempt to then say that Marxism remains part of our social reality because there are people putting up resistance in various forms among various groups, not only because it then starts to blur the core, deep, hard-to-overcome fact of the just enormous global defeat of Marxism of the 20th century and how we live in the backwash of that, but also it leads to kind of tailism, like tailist politics. Whenever somebody's putting up a resistance to wrong somewhere, then you kind of show up because you take that to be Marxism and then you're doing Marxism when you're supporting. Again, I'm not saying it's wrong to support those things, or right, but the evaluation doesn't seem to come from saying, oh, well, it's Marxist because it's resistance. Plural struggles just means, yeah, there are a lot of different groups that have engaged in forms of resistance to the wrongs they experience. But I think we can't both say, oh, well, we have to expand our conception of class and at the same time say Marxism isn't centrally about working class revolution. It's got to be one or the other of the things. I think it's one, and the defeat is it's a bitter pill to swallow. I don't enjoy that fact. I don't want it to be true, but it's true. So I'm suspicious both of confusing revolution with resistance and with then wanting to expand Marxism to finding anywhere you find agents who are engaged in some kind of struggle. I think it also leads to an unwillingness to incorporate that background historical reality into how we think about what even those struggles mean. I think it can lead to a kind of dishonesty about what really it is possible for those particular agents to achieve or do, given what it is that they're involved in doing. So at that level, I really do think we agree. We seem to both, or at least in your opening remarks, I took you to be agreeing that the 20th century ended something extremely significant. There was a long, protracted struggle across the globe that involved a lot of violence and politics, and then it ended, and one side lost. And that is something of sort of more profound significance than the then reappearance of this or that kind of struggle in a particular location. So that's why if that's still a thought that you agree with, then it seems to me it has to really influence what we take these moments of resistance to be. I don't see them as the rebirth or the modification or the ongoing promise of whatever the promise of the 20th century was for Marxism.
Yeah, I guess I do. Right? I don't think, I'm not willing to sort of kind of wallow in defeat. I'm not willing to say that the fact that capital has been consolidated in an ever smaller part of the capitalist class, so much so that we're moving away from economies that are really capitalist in the strong sense and much more rentierist. I've been calling it neo-feudal. I don't think that means that the promise of the struggles of the producers, I've also been adding, and I would say carers or service workers, the promise of all of the oppressed isn't still a real one, right? Like I'm a little struck by your reluctance to you're worrying about broadening the term. I mean, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels say, a communist are those who are on the side of the oppressed in every struggle. Right, that's Marx and Engels. That's Marxism. That's not some sort of eclectic spreading. Right? By your definition, it seems like the Russian and Chinese revolutions wouldn't even count. So, if we don't think if that's if I'm doing too much of a parody of your view, it's more expansive than that, then I think that we have to recognize that yes, there's defeat. But that doesn't mean the game is over. I mean, that would be like, I don't know, the Democratic side lost in the Peloponnesian War, and so democracy is forever, defeated. Nobody thought that, right? I mean, France and democracies, defeated once Napoleon comes to power. No one thought that. So I don't think that we have to say that there was a historic defeat at the end of the 20th century means it's over. And means that thinking in terms of a critique of capitalism, drawing out its limitations, looking at how it works, thinking in terms of class struggle, right? That doesn't seem like it's over. It seems like it's more relevant even in a time of defeat.
I just want to add quickly. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to come in, but I'm allowing myself in.
There are no rules here.
There are.
Okay.
He makes it.
Take it back.
I'm just thinking of the mass demonstrations of 2019, for example, which were sort of lost in the backwash of COVID, which were unprecedented. Global, Sudan, Hong Kong, across Europe, the yellow vests in France, on an unprecedented scale, and then followed by, in 2020, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the United States and outside of the United States. And we need to look back on these. There was nothing like that in the late 20th century except for 1968, which, I mean, if you look at it numbers for numbers, 2019-20 across the COVID period were more significant in scale than the 68 events. What are those, and what do they represent, and how do they fit into the lens of defeat? I'm sending to Alex first because I think it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought those up, because I actually think that one of the things that really first got me thinking this way was my experience with what at that time had been the largest protests in the globe, was the anti-Iraq war protests. We were there. These were huge. These were the largest national and global protests in human history, and they did nothing.
Yeah, they did nothing.
They did nothing. And I couldn't figure out, how is it possible for there, on the one hand, to be a mass mobilized force of such scale that had no social power whatsoever and then got weaker as the war went along. Contrast that with Vietnam, where the protests got more intense, larger in scale, better organized, and more able to affect political outcomes. And it seemed, for me, this really vivified the degree to which the post-60s politics in particular became the politics of sort of the appearance and disappearance of social forces with no enduring power to be a kind of social agent over time. And that protest culture had become a kind of culture, that what we'd had was something closer to a global carnival than, in fact, a serious threat to the social order. They just waited it out. This was actually why I was so surprised initially at the crackdown on Gaza. I just thought, why not wait till the semester's over and everyone's going to go home like they always do, right? So to me, it's precisely the scale bears no relationship to the social and political power. And to me, that is what it's like to live in a period of very low-level politics, where we just cannot imagine, we cannot fool ourselves. I'm not wallowing in defeat. Pigs wallow because they enjoy it, right? Like they really, like you see them doing it. It's like, if I were like that, that would be a good time. This is like a horror movie. We have to jump into the pool filled with hypodermic needles. Like, it's not enjoyable.
Terrible.
Like, it's just suffering. Like, it's right. We see it, right? Like, they can just go to war, right? So, like, my point wasn't, now let's be against party form, but we have to think about how things like political parties and political representation from the standpoint of what that's like, where no ruling power feels like they have to do a particularly good job of representing anyone. Right? So that's why neither party in our country feels like they have to adopt a particularly consistent anti-war position, despite that being the vast supermajority position of the population. They can just go to war. Trump is not behaving any differently from Obama.
Right.
Yeah, Obama went and assassinated a leader, right, of Libya. Obama started this form of war, right? He invaded Libya, assassinated a leader, and left the country in ruins, right? That's exactly what Trump is doing. Because in the end, what they realized is they are not accountable, because there are no real forms of social power able to bring the political representatives to heel. So what has withered away with the retreat of the working class is the capacity to force democratic representation on political parties. But in this sense, I just think the Marxist parties left reflect that just as much. In some ways, they're less accountable because they don't really win votes. At least Democrats occasionally have to pretend like they want to win an election and get enough people to agree with what they think they're going to do, and likewise Republicans. So to me, that's how I would respond to these the scale in no way proportional to the actual social or political power of these kinds of protests, and how that's a feature of this particular kind of politics we live in.
Jodi.
Yeah, I agree with so much of what you're saying about the kind of politics we live in right now. I mean, it's really quite remarkable how little capacity popular movements are having on a direct ability to affect government, and it's gotten worse and worse, right? I mean, I'm just obsessed with this AI stuff right now, and it just feels like it's forced on us, and we just have no way to escape it. It seems very much to be almost like a kind of technological version of the politics of the two mainstream parties, just not the same phenomenon in a different, in a different material. And then I start to think, well, what do you do under those circumstances? It's like you still have to struggle, and you still have to fight, and you have to find openings. And you can't do it like with like rosy-colored glasses on, right? But to say like, oh, you're weak, like, yes, that's right. And then it means a matter of trying to find ways to get stronger. I mean, I think it's precisely because of the appearance and disappearance of movements that a party form is crucial for the left, for the revolutionary left. I don't think it needs to take or should take the form of an electoral party. But I think it is indispensable as a way to knit together struggles and movements that appear and reappear, to have something that can endure. I mean, at the very level of like, do you have a group of people who have megaphones and know how to make a banner? I mean, that might seem really trivial, but most things are not completely spontaneous. Right? Most things are relying on existing bodies. Like one of the things that I thought was really educational about the student encampments for Gaza was how much so many of them relied on pre-existing SJP groups. Right? So without those groups, I don't think, I don't know about y'all's campus, but on many campuses, they wouldn't have been able to happen, right? And they also needed the connections to the communities that the SJP groups and the alumni also had. So there was something about the ability to have an existing infrastructure, even when it was unpopular, illegal in many places, right? You couldn't have an SJP. You couldn't have, participating in BDS in some places, not legal, but that infrastructure, 20-year-old infrastructure, has made a difference. So I would say then, those aspects of reality, the need to organize people, they're under conditions of defeat, that hasn't changed, right? What has changed is maybe it's gotten worse, but I don't think that means that, start all over. You don't need a theory of revolution. You don't need a theory that looks at the class distribution of power. You don't need a theory that says, who's got material, where are the material forces, where are the weaknesses? I mean, I think we still need all of those things. And I don't think talking about those is dogmatic at all, right? I actually, honestly, I think dogmatism is a canard. Like in 2026, like that's not our problem. Our problem is not dogmatism. Our problem is eclecticism and kind of like, oh, this is easy, let's do this. Or, everybody just wants, it used to, it's just everybody wants to like write something or blog something or make a video or make a TikTok. That's going to solve all the problems. No, it's got to be the slow work of organization. I actually thought we agreed on that score.
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, I think the problem I still have, it's true that organizations are necessary in order to do collective action. I'm with that. Someone's got to know how to do banners. My experience with all these protests was those organizations can start just looking like highly politicized event planners. Because if you went out, you went on a protest, it was fun or not fun, depending on the weather. There were a lot of people in costumes and so on. And then the next day, that had been absorbed into the public life of society, in which case you'd had a good event, and it was expressively satisfying. I had expressed my discontent and my dislike, and I had no experience of exercising any effective social power whatsoever. And if the point of the organization is to exercise effective social power, then I'm not really asking, who can do the banners and set the march and so on. I need some first-order thinking about what's the agent that could exercise effective social power and to what end. And that doesn't mean that anywhere I see resistance, that's what's going on. So that's one reservation I have about this. But the other is that I take the Marxian perspective on this. I try to avoid the Talmudic, arguing over, chapter and verse, which translation, and so on. But the way I understand the point about men make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing, is that the danger is always that the intention you have for your action might be different from the purposes you actually end up serving.
Sure.
So you've got to know the conditions in which you are acting. Otherwise, you're acting for someone else, despite you having in mind something else. I actually think the protest against what Israel was doing is a complicated case in point. The most powerful criticism was that it's a genocide. Genocide is a category of liberal international law. That kind of critique of Israel placed the focus on the committing of humanitarian, gross atrocities against humanity, and directed the actual politics of it towards things like international humanitarian law, the International Criminal Court, and other institutions of the Pax Americana, post end of Cold War, with which the current administration and Israel are breaking. But that's a situation in which it certainly wasn't clear to me that it served anything like the interests of, say, Palestinians and national self-determination, if that is the goal that one wants to serve. It didn't serve a national liberation. If anything, it just participated in the same kind of language that had always stood behind international intervention. When I started hearing people say genocide, I thought, in a year we're going to have a UN occupation of Gaza. Yeah. And instead we have an altered version of that, right? Peace. But that's where the protests people are engaged in. I was at protests. I know the point, but the circumstances aren't ours to make. We aren't in a position in any way to make circumstances. The conditions make us, and that's what made those kinds of protests into essentially attempt to kind of restore the interventionism of the preceding period. And that is the problem with just asking the question, where's there an organization with power, blah, blah, blah. In these conditions, no one has this. It's hard. I'm not, like I said, I got into Marx because I think there's something gross and fundamentally and structurally wrong with the society that I live in. I want to change it. I just don't think that we can right now, and that inability, that fact, the sense in which you're just determined by those who do have the power to do so, really has to affect our thinking, and really has, I think it means that one has to kind of rebuild the kinds of thoughts and politics that we care about from the ground up. That's the part of the reason for my hostility and suspicion to any dogmatic thinking. Like the concepts, I'm not, there's lots of injustice associated with capitalism. Pointing them out does nothing, I think, actually, at present, to really identify, organize, and mobilize the kinds of social agents that could transform society. It's not an effective form of social critique, unfortunately.
I give Minneapolis credit for getting rid of Kristi Noem. Right?
Yeah, they did a great
I think
job.
That's really important. That was consistent, organized uprising and resistance. That was 2 consecutive weekends with
but wait, just so I know what we're talking about. Yeah. I'm talking about what Marx... Yeah, I don't know how many of those people were Marxist or thought they were doing Marxist politics. There's a lot of protest that causes disruption and changes politics. But I'm thinking specifically about Marxism.
The question that
it's not Marxism.
The idea from Jameson is reality Marxist, right?
Yeah.
And that you were rejecting. It's not the same thing as, is every person in a movement thinking like a Marxist? That's not what the question is. There would never have been a revolution in Russia or China if the thing depended on, hey, are every one of you, are y'all Bolsheviks? Now we're going to do it? No, that's not what it is. So I don't think that argument works, right? Like, if you want to say not every uprising should be lumped into a Marxist category, I would give you that, because I don't think all of the COVID-19 protests I would not call all of them uprisings of the oppressed. Right, I would say some of them were petit bourgeois attempts to make sure that there was no regulation for the public good in terms of public health. Right, there's uprisings going to be across the political spectrum. There'll be uprisings that don't have a politics. It's the role of Marxist, the role of the party, the role of organized, I'd say an organized left, to give a kind of voice an ideology, a political framing to the movement. So it's not like it comes up first, like with the politics given from the ground from the very beginning. That's not the case. And part of the defeat of the left has been the unwillingness of people on the left to actually give voice and give a political framing to the actual movements that actually make them legible as class struggle.
Yeah, I was sort of with you till the last sentence. That wasn't class struggle. That was good democratic politics. I thought the protests were excellent democratic politics against anti-democratic.
I wasn't saying Minneapolis was class struggle. Just said,
oh, okay. Yeah. But I mean, I guess I'm inclined to, it's like, in many ways, the further thing I guess I'm trying to get at with what the 20th century means is that we don't really get to decide what Marxism is. Marxism is the historical experience with Marxism, including its defeat. And it's currently the experience of the Communist Party of China. It's the last sort of major representative of an organized form of that politics. And so part of my way of thinking about what it means, what the historic defeat means, is that there's all kinds of arguments one should make. But I think it may very well be much more effective to kind of recover the concepts without the label. So the really profound thing about Minneapolis, I think, was that it exposed the complete lack of authority that our political representatives have, and the fragility of that authority manifests itself as just an attempt to be authoritarian. They just use coercive force against people, and that what it was an effective exercise of democratic civil liberties. And to start building out our way of thinking from sort of first-order concepts like that, rather than try to say what's going on here is or isn't Marxist, or it would be Marxist if it were then to take the following kind of form. I think that the accrued historical experience has just left us without a convincing account of what that mediation is at all. So they took Kristi Noem's scalp, fine, metaphorically for whoever's surveilling this particular conversation. She was doomed anyway, but whatever. But the analysis to have of that, it seems to me, is to think, well, what does democratic politics look like in the wake of the failure of things like mass working class politics? Not then, how can we now find this one and turn it into the thing that failed? I think that's sort of the difference. I think that the meaning of the defeat is much more thoroughgoing, and what it means for our political thinking and the development of our ideas is much more root and branch from the ground up.
So first, just both of us are political theorists. We actually both had at least one of the same dissertation advisor.
Yes, that's very weird.
Years ago.
Who was
a lot of years
quite a ferocious anti-Marxist.
And so I'm saying this in part because to another political theorist, I feel like the last 20 or 30 years of political theory has all been democratic theory. And just constantly, there's this democracy and this kind of democracy, and everything is democracy all the time. And that's been shattered. Right? That's been shattered. That language of democracy has accompanied the most extreme redistribution of wealth and rise in inequality. The lack of an ability to have any kind of presence within the political system has come about at the same time as the flourishing of democratic theory. So, it seems to me like a really strange argument to say, oh, we just really need to make sure we have more first-order democratic theory. I'm like, God, dude, there's so much of that. So that's my first response is just, that doesn't, and maybe it's just me, I just don't find all those, this democracy, that democracy, but participatory democracy, okay, everybody, tweets something, or, but participatory budget planning, which was really just another way to make people redistribute the decreasing amounts of wealth, right? All of these things do not seem like they've ushered in something useful. So that's the first part. The second thing, when we're thinking about Marxism, what are we talking about? I want to emphasize Walter Rodney again, because my states here are to say that Marx is not Marx. To talk about Marxism is not just to talk about Marx. To be a Marxist is not just to be like a European 19th century fan, right? It's to anchor oneself in a broad working class, anti-colonial, revolutionary traditions. I want to draw on Rodney. Rodney defended Marxism as a third world ideology. And he said Marxist method could be applied to any society. And it wasn't because all societies were the same or developed in the same way or had an enormous industrial proletariat. No, it was because of Marxist method. And he emphasizes three aspects of it. It requires a concrete analysis of the concrete situation, especially in terms of its contradictions. And I think that's what you're doing, Alex. And that makes you a good Marxist. And it shows us that even you are in a Marxist reality, right? So Marxist method requires a concrete analysis of the concrete situation, especially bringing out the contradictions. Second, it's always being developed and extended, right? Not just Marx, Mao, Che, Cabral, so many others. And it's an ideology that seeks to oppose and develop alternatives to capitalism. So insofar as one opposes and wants to develop alternatives to capitalism, Marxism remains indispensable.
Yeah, sorry, we've got hands.
We were going to hold the hands until the second half.
Okay.
But, there are limited rules.
Yeah, really, yes.
So
there are rules
if
made by the leader.
If anyone really wishes to ask, please do. Let's do it. Tim? Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah,
That was good.
Is this okay? This is wonderful. When we invited Jodi and Alex to this event, they both said, but we agree on everything. There's not going to be a debate. This is not going to work out.
I didn't have lunch, so I'm very.
Okay. I want to. Ask you each a question, and it really is around the Jameson quote, because it seems to me that Alex, you do agree with Jameson, the Jameson quote, insofar as what that quote is saying is that reality is historical materialist. Reality is class struggle. We're in a situation where the party in the United States that understands that reality is class struggle is the Republican Party. Trump is in fact a class struggle genius, and not only that, he's undertaken a critique of bourgeois forms of the democratic institutions in a way that is practically Marxist. I mean, we don't. I mean, when we talk about the critique of bourgeois right, Trump doesn't believe in bourgeois rights, and in fact, he's persuaded the entire country that bourgeois rights don't work. The other thing relates to the party form. The Republicans have understood the party form far better than the Democrats have, because the Tea Party essentially was the sort of like the inauguration of the political shifts that have now convulsed the country, and that's a classic kind of like party form. So my question, I have a question for each of you. One is that Alex, I think that what you're arguing for is a very fundamental, like, reorganization of our categories of Marxist analysis in order to respond to a reality that has radically shifted. And I guess I would just want to prompt you to say a little bit more about how you understand those necessary transformations of Marxist categories that respond to our current moment. And I guess the question for you, Jodi, is then something like the party. I mean, the party form. How is it that the left, and I mean, of course, the left, the real left, how can the left undertake the kinds of appropriations of the party form that we have seen taking place very successfully on the rise? Okay, Alex, you, and then Jodi.
It's a great set of comments and questions, Timothy. That's it's what I'm trying to figure out. You might be right. Maybe I am, in the way you described, a historical materialist, because, and if that is what Jameson really meant there, then maybe that's what he really meant. And so then I can agree with that reading of what he says. So, Jen, to carry out the thought, yeah, we what it means to have the concepts that we have is for them to help us grasp the reality that we live in. And that is the task I understood Marx to be involved in before he got interested in the working class at all. And his just attempt to develop what a critique of society is. He didn't do that by trying to figure out, is the working class revolutionary or not? He was interested originally in the critique of the modern state and the critique of religion. So I'm inclined to think what this looks like is sort of, well, how did Marx get to the working class in the first place? How did he get there? And he got there by asking questions like, he's the one who has actually goes through one of the first experiences of the failure of the liberal state to live up to its promise of freedom. So ask that. Why is the liberal state unable to live up? And why does its failure to live up to the promise of freedom take this particular form? And what do we learn from that? That's how he moves from the critique of religion to the critique of politics. Because I think he comes to see the fundamental question. The real critic is not the critic. It's the agent with the power to, in fact, transform those social institutions that are self-contradictory. That's how he starts thinking through sort of the relationship between economy and the state, and starts to arrive at the thinking that then leads him to think, so what is that agent? Who is it that has an interest in transform? What is the agent that's produced by these social institutions that nonetheless has an interest in overthrowing them in a way that would in fact expand freedom, expand universal human freedom rather than just satisfy their own interests? What does that look like? I think it means that not assuming that the task is to figure out how to revive class struggle. It means scaling backwards and trying to understand, okay, well, what were the particular kinds of concerns that leads one to think that class struggle could have been the means to that end? In an era where the defining feature of the conditions we live in is that class struggle is no such means. There is no such struggle available to us. What would it look like to criticize this kind of a society in light of the detritus that is left by the defeat? So Marx says, every revolution ends in revolution. Sorry, every historical era ends in revolution or the common ruin of the contending classes. It's the common ruin of the contending classes is the defining feature of ours. It's why we have such... I don't think Trump is actually that much of a genius at all. He just ran against Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris. Like incredibly unpopular, terrible politicians who are incredibly unpopular, nominated by ridiculous parties of very limited interest in developing a sustained politics that represented coherent groups of interests. And the fact that he's completely run aground on his own policies tells us that. So this is the common ruin of the contending classes. It's incredibly short term. It's in fact not very good at looking out for the long-term interests of capital, right? Because there's nothing that creates the pressure on society for the ruling class to be anything like a ruling class at all. The crypto bros don't represent capital, right? The long-term interests of capital. But that's who's close to Trump, Or the Chevron executives? I don't think so. So, and even these wars aren't in the long-term interests of capital. So they're really good at accelerating the decline of American empire. I don't quite see how that's serving wider imperial interests. So I guess that's what it would look to me. And I will say it's one reason why when I write, I have generally not written my works as like, this is a Marxist work of X. Because to me, it seems to me to invite more confusion. Because everyone brings every association they could possibly have with Marx and Marxism, and then gets surprised or confused, or you get tied up in a debate about what is and isn't Marxism. I cite when I think a particular thought owes special reference to that thought within Marx. But for the most part of what it looks like is just trying to make the best arguments you can and not necessarily try to advertise them or claim that what they really are the correct reading of Marx, because I just think the historical and political distance is so great.
Jodi, you want to take Tim's question?
Yeah, I want to, I've got the question from here. I wanted to just address Alex's point at the end. When you're saying you don't necessarily write, as a Marxist, to me, what I hear is like there are always a set of political and professional choices about the labels one uses to present one's work, right? When you speak in one way before some kind of audiences. And best arguments, I think, depends on best arguments for whom and in what context. And so I wanted to qualify those things because I don't feel like what we've been discussing here is, as we're not like an activist organization determining a campaign and are we going to meet the community by saying, hey, we're the Marxists, we've come to help, right? That's not what the discussion is, right? So I want to just sort of bracket the labels and making the best arguments question, because I think both of those are really context dependent. I think the question of about reviving class struggle is something different, right? That to me is the question of strategy. And I think it's going to be becoming a bigger and bigger deal if the AI jobs apocalypse is real. And then it becomes a real question of, are all of the people who've been displaced into really crappy jobs going to be part of a mass movement on the behalf of the poor, benighted professional managerial class that's now unemployed? I think that's a hard sell. I do think it's an interesting challenge, right? Is it going to be the case that all of the out-of-work software developers are going to be able to unite, right? The class struggle means right now for us that in fact a class of asset holders is winning. That doesn't mean that the masses are not winning. Doesn't mean the class struggle is not happening. It just means we're losing it, and it means that we've got real challenges to figure out how it's going to be possible to wage it. And I don't think anybody has any good answers right now. I do take hope though from the work of nurses and teachers. There's been a lot of organizing efforts in Silicon Valley. Google workers in particular have been trying, and I think it's no surprise that coders are getting the jobs that are getting wiped out, in part because of the backlash against tech workers who've been trying, essentially for the last 5-6 years. So I think the challenges that you mention are real. Now, on the party form question, I think it's really hard to imagine a far left party being able to use the same methods that the right used the conservatives used in taking over the Republicans. I just read Paul Heidemann's Rogue Elephant. It's really good. Rogue Elephant on the Rise of Trump, and it traces it through. Essentially, there's a lot of the disintegration of business operating as a class, which Alex rightly pointed out, right? Capital is not operating as a class right now. It's acting as sectors in a really sectarian way that's not in the interests of the entire class. And Heidemann talks about this, and he talks about the way that the fundraising environment for Republicans shifted power away from out of the party and into the hands of financial networks, not just the Koch network, but then the ones that came after that, right? Like the Mercers, and then now like the Silicon Valley people. So does it seem likely that this kind of finance is going to go into a left that's critical of capitalism? I think it's really hard to imagine. I think so. It makes it, and Alex mentioned the pathetic nature of the Democrats, unable to present someone vaguely electable. That actually shows, I think, a real limitation of the Democrats' ability to operate in this environment. So, maybe this is a lack of imagination, but to me what it means is this stuff breaks. And then you only have the fight from below. That I do think that's a degree of a lack of imagination, but I don't, the lack is real.
Well,
Can I just...
That's really the same state the Republicans were in when the Tea Party took over the Republican Party. In other words, we might be in the state in a moment where actually it's an amazing opportunity for the Democratic Party to be taken over, infiltrated from below. In other words.
I mean, I wish, right? Like, that would be the best of all possible worlds. What Heidemann makes clear, and it's a really good book. It's an easy read too, as in like you can read it in a day. And like he associates the ability of the Tea Party to do what it did with Newt Gingrich, and Newt Gingrich is willingness to basically turn political debate into a blood sport, and to break with the norms of the House and make everything about patronage and ability to fight. And this created a dynamic where insurgents would move further and further to the right, and then they would get funding, and then they would keep going. And that's a dynamic that doesn't seem plausible on the Democratic side if you want the Democrats to move to the left. Right? Like, the left has not had this kind of political will, and the last person who gave it a shot, Bernie, so many of us had so much hope, this didn't work. And so I don't think this means it'll never work. I don't think that at all. But right now, it seems like, at least if you look at the finance dynamics and the norms within the party, they're not working in favor of that kind of option.
There's a question up here.
Can I just do a small response to while you're walking which is, I noticed in Jodi's response a little bit of the old religion coming back, which was the response to, I'm worried about the AI jobs apocalypse because, and then what was the worry? So, well, maybe that group is going to become this rebellious working class element that will be usable, or maybe they'll become bad. And that's just the question that is, there's large swaths of the working class right now that are in much worse conditions than whoever's going to lose jobs to AI, the kind of college-educated professional class that suddenly isn't going to be able to get a job at a law firm. And yet those people who are worse off aren't rebelling en masse in the way that we saw in the 20th century. So when I see the AI jobs thing, there are questions to ask, but my question isn't, is that going to finally reawaken something that isn't reawaken the possibility for class struggle? I think it's a different set of questions. That would be another way of responding to you. It's like, where do I see the prospects for, or where do I see people engaged in something like the attempt to expand the scope of their freedom? That, to me, was the question that led Marx eventually to think about class struggle and the proletariat. But that's where we are. It's not, maybe they will. Maybe it will provoke the thing that nothing else has managed to provoke over the past 30 years.
Yeah, sure.
This responds partly to that, too. I wonder if you are falling out, so to speak, over something that you both agree on at another level that I don't concede. So, Alex, you said Marx is nothing without the revolutionary proletariat, and then we're debating what kind of counts as resistance. And my points are, Marx wrote a lot of things. You guys have quoted some of his texts. He did not, to my knowledge, write a 5,000-page book about the party form. He wrote a 5,000-page book about capital, which is figured hardly at all in this discussion, or bourgeois right. You're focusing, I think, on something that Marx was empirically kind of crappy at, which is revolutionary struggle. He's not Mao, he's not Lenin, who had a better track record with this. That's not where Marx was good at. It's like when people point out that Freud was not an especially gifted clinician. My view is that Marxism is actually not really a good way to think about class, not a good way to think about class struggle. What Marxism is good at is about thinking about what capitalism does to class. So I think both of you are, in different ways, looking at, let's say Alex is looking for kind of historically specific 19th century forms of the working class and working class struggle and saying, well, we don't have that anymore. And you're saying, sure, we don't have that anymore, but maybe these things could count. In my view, Marx, especially in Capital, is looking at a different question, which is how capital and capitalism transform wage labor. And if we don't have those forms anymore, Marx in Capital gives a good account of the transformation and invisibilization of those prior, more positivist, empirically graspable, sociological aspects of class. So to grab some people and say that you're the working class, Marx in Capital shows capital undoing that. So for instance, he doesn't talk about the proletariat in Capital. Etienne Balibar has a great essay about this. He calls the proletariat variable capital. If you look throughout the book Capital to look where is the proletariat, it's in that category. It's in a category of political economy. And I say all this because this is what Marx spent his life theorizing, and it hasn't really come into the debate. But my polemical view is you all agree that Marx is about the working class, and my contention is Marxism is really not a good way of thinking about class. It's about what capital does to class.
I think this might be a good time with that question, and please come back after the break, because I do think that is a critical point. What's your name? Ben. Yes, that's a critical point for us to continue on. There are a lot of issues on the table. We do have refreshments. We're going to take 15 or so minutes, so get your refreshments quickly, and we'll come back and continue the conversation with much more from the floor when we do come back. Thank you so much.